Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about 6 players who are rising up draft boards as we approach our 2024 fantasy football draft. So what I've gone ahead and done over the course of the last 2 weeks is collected data via Underdog Fantasy in regards to the top 200 ranked players via ADP. So I've gone ahead and taken those numbers from August 1st and August 15th in order to see the biggest difference in which players are rising based on average draft position over the course of the last 2 weeks as we approach our 2024 fantasy football draft. So I'll talk about 6 players, give you guys an indication as to why they are rising up draft boards, give you guys statistical analysis as to what gives them fantasy value going into 2024 and why we might want to be investing in them as we approach our 2024 fantasy football draft. Now, before we get into talking about these 6 players, a couple reminders. If you have not yet already, subscribe. Of course, we are on our way to 100,000 subscribers. Cannot thank you guys enough. Additionally, for those of you guys who wanted advantage upon your league mates this summer and going into the entirety of this upcoming season, be sure to travel down below into the description and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, all you have to do is sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only are you going to be able to claim the first-time deposit offer, but you're going to get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide. That email will be sent from myself or Underdog directly to you. Additionally, you'll get draft rankings. Those will be updated every single week. Look for an email from me directly to you. Of course, check your spam folder, but the emails won't stop there. They'll also continue every single Sunday morning throughout the entire season, weeks 1 through 18, where I'll be sending you weekly rankings by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, includes flex, all-encompassing rankings. So again, if you want to get your hands on my 2024 fantasy football draft guide, check out Underdog Fantasy, use code Andrew, make that first-time deposit today. If you're eligible, based on the map to the right side of the screen, you can go ahead and do so today. But if you're not eligible, perhaps you've already gone ahead and signed up, or based on your current location, you cannot sign up. You can also check out Patreon, sign up for the 2022 Fantasy Champion tier, and get all of this content and much more. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about these must-draft players, specifically because of the variables surrounding them, allowing them to be far more valuable prospects as we approach our 2024 fantasy football drafts. Now, in the case of Rashee Rice, he has most recently jumped 9.4 overall positions within the top 200 rankings. He's gone from wide receiver 36 to wide receiver 31, and many may point to the idea that Marquise Hollywood-Brown in the first preseason game sustained an injury, and he is going to miss significant time, and because of that, it may give Rashee Rice more value. Or maybe it's pointing to the fact that even though he had offseason trouble, the National Football League hasn't levied a suspension upon him, and perhaps he is not going to face a suspension in 2024. But the influence in my mind that is the most powerful going into this upcoming season, regardless of whether or not Marquise Hollywood-Brown is healthy, whether or not he's going to be suspended, is the fact that Rashee Rice found a lot of success in year 1, and over the course of the last 5+ years, we have seen rookie wide receivers that find success in year 1 often are continuing to do the same in year 2 and in fact improving. So when we talk about second-year wide receivers that have the potential going into 2024 to elevate their game, the eligible wide receivers consist of Rashee Rice, Puka Nacua, Jaden Reed, Jordan Addison, and Zay Flowers. So for those of you who are anticipating and investing in these players this offseason, listen up here. So since 2017 through 2022, we have seen 25 total rookie wide receivers average 8.5 or more fantasy points per game in their rookie year in a half PPR scoring format. Of those 25 rookie wide receivers who was able to accomplish that, 18 of them, of the total 25, making it a 72% rate, had improved fantasy point per game averages in year 2. If you exclude the Deebo Samuel injury, that's a 75% success rate. 3 out of every 4 wide receivers going from year 1 to year 2 making a statistical bump, even though they were averaging 8.5 fantasy points per game in their rookie year. Now, the reason why I landed on 8.5 fantasy points per game is because by a 17-game pace, that allows the wide receiver to score 144.5 fantasy points, which over the course of the last 3 seasons has averaged out to wide receiver 35 overall. Because of course, we want to have top 36 ranked wide receivers on our team that are going to lead us to success. Now, when we talk about wide receivers ranked within the top 36, from 2017 to 2022, there have been 22 different rookie wide receivers who have finished within the top 36 rankings their rookie season. Of those 22 wide receivers, 16 of them were able to repeat in year 2, finishing as a top 36 wide receiver, which is a 73% success rate. If you exclude the injuries of Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Christian Watson in year 2, that number jumps to an 84% success rate. Again, players like Rashee Rice, Puka Nacua, Jaden Reed, Jordan Addison, and Zay Flowers have a very good opportunity, assuming they stay healthy, 84+% chance of once again finishing within the top 36 and all having statistical upgraded seasons in comparison to last year. Now for Puka Nacua, he's going to have to make big strides in order to elevate his fantasy point per game averages, but the rest of the field certainly is capable of doing so in this overall circumstance. Now, when we talk about Rashee Rice and going into this upcoming season, what are we anticipating to see from him within this offense? I mean, he has been the first relevant wide receiver of a Kansas City Chiefs offense since we have seen the departure of Tyreek Hill just a couple seasons ago. But the beginning of the 2023 year wasn't pretty for Rashee Rice. He didn't come in and immediately make an impact and immediately become a starter. He started off weeks 1 through 6 of the 2023 year, only playing 38% of the offensive snaps within this offense, averaging 4.67 targets per game and 7.78 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Now, once we got to week 7 through 17, he took over, averaging 7.4 targets per game, 12.63 fantasy points per game, while playing 71% of the offensive snaps throughout the span of time, week 7 through 17 with Patrick Mahomes and the boys. He was the number 17 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points per game on average. In games in which he was given ample opportunity plus, he was a dominant force in games in which he had 6 or more targets, averaging 14.03 fantasy points per game. He had himself a 26% target percentage last season. That means on 26% of the routes that he ran, he was targeted. So 1 out of every 4 routes plus that he was running, he was getting targeted on, which again is a great number. Additionally, he was number 10 amongst all wide receivers in yards per route run, number 4 in terms of yards after the catch amongst wide receivers, and had a 77.45% catch rate, which is an unbelievable number. The more times he's going to catch the ball and have that high of a catch rate, the more confidence Patrick Mahomes is going to have continuing to litter him with targets. And obviously it led to success, primarily because Rashee Rice was the slot receiving option of this offense. He was top 20 in all slot receiving statistics, targets, receptions, receiving yards, receiving touchdowns. And of course, when you're able to put him in the slot position, Andy Reid, as the primary play caller of this offense, is able to find a lot of mismatches for him to take advantage of. Now, of course, that trust continued to build all last season with Patrick Mahomes, considering that catch rate. But when you get down to the red zone, Patrick Mahomes is looking for his number 1 targets. He's looking for Travis Kelce, and eventually it became Rashee Rice in 2023. Rashee Rice was number 8 amongst all players last season in red zone targets, and he was number 5 amongst all players in the National Football League in terms of red zone receiving touchdowns. He had 22 targets and 6 receiving touchdowns last year within the red zone. And I only think that number is only going to increase this season, primarily because the 2023 Kansas City Chiefs took a dip in terms of their overall touchdowns scored as an offense. They only scored 37 total touchdowns as an offense. In 2022 and 2021, their offense scored 59 and 53 touchdowns. There is a huge potential for this offense to take a step forward with the additions of Xavier Worthy, Marquise Hollywood Brown, improving this team as a whole, and of course more experience within these young players. I'm anticipating the Kansas City Chiefs offense to be far more superior than they were last season. And in that overall scenario, Rashee Rice taking further steps in year 2 to increase his fantasy point per game average and be far more reliable for our teams. Currently sitting at an ADP of 90.1, a player that we should absolutely be investing in based on the overall scenario. Moving on to the next player I wanted to mention, speaking of year 2 players, let's talk about Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. He has most recently changed his ADP by 14.5 spots. Again, going from RB34 to RB28 in just the last 2 weeks. Whenever a player is able to jump a whole round in terms of ADP, we have to pay attention. And the reason why this is currently taking place is because there has been a lot of conversation as to who's going to be the starting running back of this organization as the 2024 season begins. And of course, by the time we get to the end, who will be at the top of that overall conversation between Zach Moss and Chase Brown. Now, Zach Moss was brought in this offseason primarily because of the Cincinnati Bengals not wanting to re-sign Joe Mixon, so they traded him to the Houston Texans. Now, Joe Mixon, obviously, over the course of the last 3 seasons, finishing as a top 12 running back in fantasy football each of those 3 seasons, has pretty big shoes to fill. So the question is, are they going to be filling those shoes with both of Zach Moss and Chase Brown's overall contributions? Or are one of these running backs potentially going to be in pole position to carry this backfield and gain the vast majority of the fantasy value? Now, what we have heard this offseason, especially based on the beat writers for the Cincinnati Bengals and everything that we have seen from the clips that come out of practice, is that Chase Brown is digging into the overall workload of Zach Moss. And even though Zach Moss was anticipated to be the primary number 1 back, we're beginning to see a lot of splits within the first team offense for both of their overall utilizations. Now, between the two, Zach Moss is built to be an early down back, first and second downs. while Chase Brown is more inclined to be a receiving back on third down scenarios, 2-minute drill, etc. And that's pretty much how he was utilized late last season. In 2023, Chase Brown played weeks 13 through 18 at a far greater rate than which he did the rest of the season prior to that. Primarily because this was a point within the season in which Joe Burrow was injured and they wanted to run the ball a lot more, but they also wanted to go ahead and limit the overall usage that Joe Mixon was getting. I mean, Joe Mixon from weeks 13 through 18 last season, 19.17 touches per game and 18.2 fantasy points per game. Now, as the number 2 back, Chase Brown was still efficient with his overall utilization. 8.83 touches per game, 7.28 fantasy points per game throughout those 6 games, and was quite efficient with his overall utilization, 4.12 yards per carry, and 3.36 yards after contact per attempt. Again, great numbers across the board, highly efficient. Of course, found a lot of his overall utilization within the receiving game, getting 2+ receptions in 5 of the 6 games in which he played within this offense. So the question is, can Chase Brown take over? And is his overall value jump going from RB34 to now RB28? He is already being drafted ahead of Zach Moss. Is that appropriate going into this upcoming season? And should we be following? Should we also be investing in the hype of Chase Brown and the potential that he could very easily take over this backfield? Now, before I answer that question, just a couple days ago, we did see the Cincinnati Bengals take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 1 of the preseason. Zach Moss did not play in that game. So obviously we don't have an indication as to what the split is going to look like. Once we get to the second preseason game, we'll get a greater understanding as to what the split is going to look like. But with Chase Brown as the 3-down back within this offense, he didn't look all too great. He made a lot of bad decisions in terms of his overall vision and being able to hit the correct holes within this offense, trying to bounce out runs onto the outside. Didn't really come to much success for him. Obviously, he found a lot of success within the receiving game, but he also did something that was quite surprising to me. He returned the opening kickoff for the Cincinnati Bengals. Now, you would think your starting running back isn't going to be returning kicks or playing special teams. So if that's an indicator potentially of the fact that Chase Brown may not in fact be the number 1 running back of this offense and it is going to be Zach Moss, maybe we want to buy the dip on Zach Moss. The fact that he is being utilized far less. Or do we want to stay safe and not invest in either of these two, considering it could be a 2-headed monster in which neither of them are able to find individual value on a consistent basis within this offense? My thought process as it currently stands is that there is a lot of value to be had considering what Joe Mixon was able to accomplish within this offense. Regardless of the fact that this has been a lackluster offensive line over the course of the last couple seasons, additionally on top of that, Joe Mixon has really benefited from the fact that he has been a receiving threat out of this backfield, earning himself nearly 4 receptions per game on average over the course of the last 3 seasons. So the way that I look at this backfield, it kind of reminds me of the 2022 Seattle Seahawks, Rashad Penny versus Kenneth Walker. But the thing is Chase Brown Kenneth Walker? Is Zach Moss Rashad Penny? I don't know if we can say that Chase Brown is comparable to the efforts of a Kenneth Walker, but typically in these situations, we always want to invest in the youth. The fact that the youth player has jumped the overall ADP of the veteran player within this backfield does make it more risky, but nonetheless, we want a piece of this backfield, and perhaps Chase Brown is going to be the key to that in 2024. Moving on to the next player I wanted to mention, it is Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. He's definitely jumping up draft boards and getting himself very close to the top 12 conversation. Now, for those of you who have been around the channel for quite some time, you know that I'm a Rams fan. Now, obviously, I root for all players in fantasy football because fantasy football above everything, but I'm a Cooper Kupp guy through and through. Every season, I mean, the amount of fantasy football championships Cooper Kupp won me in 2021 is disgusting. But besides that overall fact, I don't mind getting back onto the Cooper Kupp hype train, especially considering what he was able to accomplish last year. I was just hoping that there would be a potential in which his value wouldn't rise into being a wide receiver 2 objectively within, ranks 13 through 15 at the wide receiver position, because honestly, I wanted the discount. Now, the primary reason I find so much confidence within Cooper Kupp and why I know he's going to find success in 2024 has been his efforts over the course of the last 3 seasons. 2021, the number 1 overall wide receiver, the Triple Crown winner. 2022, the number 1 overall wide receiver prior to his season-ending injury. Throughout those 2 seasons, in the 29 total games he played, including the NFL playoffs, 11.24 targets per game, 21.67 fantasy points per game. He was targeted on 30% of the routes he ran throughout those 2 seasons. And even though those days are behind us, and I don't think that Cooper Kupp is going to be getting himself 22 fantasy points per game once again this upcoming season, he did go ahead and show us last season that even though he was injured, he was still a very dominant wide receiver when healthy and with Matthew Stafford. At the beginning of the 2023 year, he missed weeks 1 through 4 due to a hamstring injury. And even though he was able to return and still have a relevant number in terms of 24% target percentage, 1 out of every 4 routes he was being targeted on within the 10 healthy games he played last season with Stafford, even though these numbers are great, the most important numbers are the fantasy point, contributions that he had. From weeks 5 through 17, after returning from his injury, in games in which he played with a healthy Matthew Stafford, and which he also was healthy and didn't leave the game early due to an injury, he was averaging 8.7 targets per game and 12.75 fantasy points per game. Just to put it into perspective, a 17-game pace with that overall contribution is 148 targets and 217 fantasy points, which would have made Cooper Kupp the number 11 overall wide receiver in fantasy in 2023. Now, this was all while Puka Nacua was also producing from weeks 5 through 17 of last season, averaging 8.8 targets per game and 13.7 fantasy points per game all throughout that span of time. Identical number in terms of overall potential targets, very close numbers in terms of overall fantasy point per game averages between these two wide receivers, yet Puka Nacua sits significantly ahead of Cooper Kupp, primarily because of the age. I will say, by far and away, these guys are going to be able to coexist. And even though the age factor is certainly one that we want to talk about, primarily because once you go into your age 31 season, there is an anticipation or expectation that there is going to be a statistical drop or that you are more inclined to deal with injuries. And sure, even though that may be true, we have other elite wide receivers that have proven to us that you can stay healthy and you can still be a relevant fantasy option within the top 12 wide receivers. These wide receivers being Keenan Allen last season was number 3 in terms of fantasy points per game on average amongst all wide receivers. Mike Evans was number 6 in that category. Devontae Adams, number 18, and Cooper Kupp, number 17. In terms of fantasy points per game on average amongst all wide receivers. And all 4 of these guys were over the age of 30 last season. We even had, DeAndre Hopkins and Adam Thielen, who were both within the top 30 of this conversation, who are also both over the age of 30. If the age of a player prevents you from drafting him, so be it. That is your prerogative. I have no problem with it. But understand that last season in games in which Cooper Kupp was given 8 or more targets, he was averaging 15.37 fantasy points per game. And when you go ahead and compare Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford to other quarterback/wide receiver tandems within the league, in which the quarterback and the number 1 wide receiver are literally best friends. I mean, these guys have a podcast together. When we talk about guys like A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts, they're best friends. We're talking about Tank Dell, C.J. Stroud. These are the combinations we look for. I mean, a couple days ago when we did a live stream here on the channel, somebody asked me, hey, Andrew, do you buy into the idea of the best friend combination between quarterback and wide receiver? And the answer is yes. We have seen it on multiple occasions be one of the most dominant forces within the sport of football, but specifically in terms of fantasy football value. Now, of course, this combination between the two, the fact that they are best friends, has led to Cooper Kupp in 2023 being ranked as number 12 amongst all players in red zone targets. He had more red zone targets than Puka Nacua last season, despite the fact that Cooper Kupp didn't play weeks 1 through 4, also left a game early due to an injury, and also had a game against Green Bay in which he didn't even have Matthew Stafford at quarterback. And I went digging even further back into the past to see what the 2021 statistics were for Cooper Kupp. He posted the second highest red zone target number over the course of the past decade in 2021. He had like 41 red zone targets that year. He was only second to Demaryius Thomas's 2014 season. So again, this is an offense that is going to get him heavily involved. An offense that we have seen over the course of the last couple seasons be very dominant within the wide receiver position. Last season, Sean McVay led this offense to targeting their wide receivers the most amongst all teams in the National Football League. So of course, they can support 2 top-tier wide receivers. I mean, we did this just a couple years back in 2021. When Stafford originally came in, we questioned, can Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods both be relevant in fantasy? And they absolutely were. Cooper Kupp was number 1, but Robert Woods wasn't far behind. Throughout weeks 1 through 9, was averaging 12.74 fantasy points per game throughout those 9 games prior to his season-ending ACL injury. There's so much value within Cooper Kupp, and the fact that Puka Nacua is dealing with a knee injury has continued to grow the value of Cooper Kupp this offseason to potentially once again being the number 1 of the Rams offense, which we know is highly valuable. Moving on to the next player I wanted to mention, it is Isiah Pacheco, who has moved his overall ADP about 5 positions. Now, amongst all of the running backs that are currently within this top 15 conversation, he has seen the biggest overall shift in ADP. Now, the question is this justified? Can we find top 10 value out of a guy like Isiah Pacheco? Because that's kind of where he's being drafted at, RB 10 to 12. And the more that I dig into Isiah Pacheco's numbers, the more I like him. The more I think he truly is going to be a 3-down workhorse back that could absolutely deliver in 2024. Now, when I looked at his statistics last season from weeks 1 through 22, course, going into the NFL playoffs and into the Super Bowl, he was averaging 19 touches per game and 13.96 fantasy points per game. But I don't think that really gives you an indication as to what really he was capable of. In games in which he was given 16 or more touches, averaging 15.89 fantasy points per game, which again looks a lot prettier considering he was able to get himself 16 or more touches in 14 of the 18 games he played last year. Now, when I talk about unimpeded volume of opportunity, a kind of slogan that I've utilized over the course of the last couple seasons, what it really means is when you have an offense that isn't going to be top 10 within rushing statistics, specifically rushing attempts at the running back position, once you have an offense that is not in that category, you need a running back to get themselves over 70% of the overall rushing attempts and receiving utilization within that offense in order to really be in the top 12 conversation. Now, last season, what we were able to see out of Isiah Pacheco was dominating 81% of the running back rushing attempts and 53% of the running back targets within this offense when he was healthy. Now, going into this upcoming season, that target percentage number should increase primarily because of the absence of Jerick McKinnon. When I went digging in terms of the overall averages of what we saw with and without Jerick McKinnon in the lineup, from weeks 1 through 11 with Jerick McKinnon, Isiah Pacheco was averaging 2.9 targets, 2.5 receptions, 16.2 receiving yards per game. And without Jerick McKinnon from weeks 12 through 22, averaging 4 targets per game, 3.88 receptions per game, 17.75 receiving yards per game. That on a 17-game pace is 68 targets, 66 receptions, and 302 receiving yards. There is so much potential for Isiah Pacheco to be clear and away the 3-down back of this team and dominate within the receiving game. Now, last season, in games in which he played with McKinnon, he only ran 46% of the routes on passing plays. Without McKinnon in the lineup, that number jumped to 67% of the overall routes that he ran on passing plays. These numbers continue to increase. Now, when we talk about the contributions of this Chiefs backfield and what they utilize their running backs for, the receiving game has been definitely a vital spot within the passing game. Over the course of the last 2 seasons, this offense has ranked as number 7 and 13 in running back targets, with 112 in 2023 and 109 in 2022. They've also ranked as number 4 and number 10 in running back receptions, 93 and 87 the last 2 years. But the most important stat for the Kansas City Chiefs running backs has been receiving touchdowns. They have scored 19 receiving touchdowns over the course of the last 2 seasons. Correct. That is correct. 19 receiving touchdowns in the last 2 years, 17 of which of those 19 came within the red zone. Without Jerick McKinnon in this lineup, I don't anticipate Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Deneric Prince to take the McKinnon role. This is going to be the 3-down back year of Isiah Pacheco going into his 3rd season in which he's able to dominate. And like we mentioned with Rashee Rice earlier, the 2023 Kansas City Chiefs were not the normal Kansas City Chiefs we are used to. They only scored 37 offensive touchdowns. The 2 years prior, they scored 59 and 53 offensive touchdowns. I'm anticipating this offense to take a step forward. And of course, because you have Patrick Mahomes at quarterback, you bring in guys like Xavier Worthy, Hollywood Brown, you get him a new left tackle, you improve everything that surrounds him. He's going to lead this team to success. And of course, defenses have to respect that. There's a reason why Isiah Pacheco only faced 8 or more defenders in the box last season on 12.2% of his overall runs. There is a lot of potential for this offense and of course for Isiah Pacheco to continue to jump off draft boards because of just how valuable he certainly can be in 2024. Moving on to Darnell Mooney, who I mentioned just a couple days ago in the video in which I talked about the best picks of each round. He was my 14th round selection there. Now, Darnell Mooney is coming off of a couple lackluster seasons, but in terms of his overall ADP change, it has certainly changed primarily because of the injury that took place to Rondale Moore, season-ending injury that obviously elevates Darnell Mooney into a greater role within this offense this upcoming season. He was signed, of course, as a free agent to a 3-year, $39 million deal. $13 million a year at the wide receiver position for someone who has been as, I guess, inconsistent as he has been over the course of the last 2 seasons is quite surprising, especially considering the running back position, struggles to find any sort of money within their overall contracts. But nonetheless, when we talk about why Darnell Mooney joined the Atlanta Falcons, it was primarily because Kirk Cousins specifically mentioned that he recruited Darnell Mooney in free agency. He went to him and said, hey, I want you to sign with us. We're going to get you a deal. We'll outbid the number that the Chicago Bears are going to offer you, and you're going to be a member of our team. And that's exactly what happened. Now, when you have a guy like Kirk Cousins go in to bat for you, it really does give us confidence that Kirk Cousins is going to utilize him heavily within this offense. Primarily because if you look at the 2023 Minnesota Vikings with Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson as the primary threats of this offense, still Jordan Addison found himself a lot of success from weeks 1 through 8 as the primary number 2 wide receiver of this offense. Now, even in games in which Justin Jefferson went down with injury, Addison became the number 1 and Osborne became the number 2. If you take the numbers from weeks 1 through 8 of last season with Kirk Cousins, of the number 2 wide receivers within this offense, they were averaging 6.25 targets and 10.04 fantasy points per game. In games over the course of the last 3 seasons, where Darnell Mooney has been given 6 or more targets, 11.03 fantasy points per game. This is a wide receiver that obviously hasn't been given enough opportunity over the course of the last 2 seasons, but has been successful in the past. You go back to 2021, he was the number 24 ranked wide receiver in fantasy football. When I talk about the fact that he wasn't given opportunity, it wasn't that he just didn't have enough targets. It was because the targets that he was getting were uncatchable. In fact, if you look at his 2023 numbers, 46.7% of his targets were deemed uncatchable last season. In 2022, that number is 36.1%. Darnell Mooney was not put in a situation to succeed the last 2 years, but going into this offense, he should be able to succeed. With Zach Robinson, former passing game coordinator to the Rams, we know that the Rams last season led the National Football League in terms of wide receiver targets, wide receiver receptions, all of those overall statistics. Additionally, the Rams utilized a lot of 11 personnel. 3 wide receiver sets, 1 tight end, 1 running back, which of course for this offense is going to absolutely, work, because we know that Kirk Cousins, very familiar with Kevin O'Connell, his former head coach and play caller of the Minnesota Vikings. He also used to be a Rams offensive coordinator. So everything is shifting in the right direction. I'm anticipating to see Darnell Mooney take steps forward this season. And even though there is injuries that are boosting him up the draft boards, these are things that we have to pay attention to, because certainly he is going to have immense value for our fantasy teams. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention is J.K. Dobbins, who currently sits at an ADP, as of right now, of 147.3. He's jumped 14.3 overall ADP spots within the top 200 rankings over the course of the last 2 weeks. Jumped from RB51 to RB46. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because J.K. Dobbins, most recently, based on the official website of the Los Angeles Chargers, they named both J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards as co-starters as a starting running back. Now, J.K. Dobbins is coming off of a 2023 Achilles injury, a 2021 ACL injury, and even though he returned from the ACL injury in 2021, in 2022, played a little bit in the beginning, got his knee cleaned up, returned in 2022, and still looked good. Anytime J.K. Dobbins has been on the field, he has made a fantasy impact. I mean, the last time we saw him playing, week 1 of 2023, he had 9.2 fantasy points in just the first half of that game between the Baltimore Ravens and Houston Texans. If you go back to the end of the 2022 year, from weeks 14 through 19, averaging 15 touches per game and 13 fantasy points per game. He has proven that he can be relevant in fantasy. But the issue is that he is coming off of 2 very devastating injuries that at the running back position, typically you do not ever see running backs be able to recover from this and still have juice within their legs. But considering he is being called a co-starter within the Los Angeles Chargers offense, leads me to believe that there is still some juice within his overall legs and that he has some potential to not only compete for the job, but maybe even be the outright number 1 running back. Now, with Greg Roman as the offensive coordinator of this team, the former offensive coordinator of the Baltimore Ravens from 2019 to 2022. Of course, he was able to coach both Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, so he's very familiar with these running backs. And of course, their offense for the Ravens were run first. And that's absolutely what I anticipate to see this season, considering the Ravens throughout that span of time were averaging 355 running back rushing attempts per season. Additionally, if you take into account the other rushers within that offense, they were running the ball 500 times plus per year. Now, that was obviously because they had a guy like Lamar Jackson, but nonetheless, we know that Greg Roman wants to have an established running game. They drafted Joe Alt with their first round pick to continue to establish that running game. I mean, we already know that Harbaugh established a running game back in his days with San Francisco. In those years, Greg Roman was his offensive coordinator. So the question is, can J.K. Dobbins potentially overthrow Gus Edwards, a guy that is coming off of a year in which he had 13 rushing touchdowns and was a top 24 running back in fantasy football for the Ravens? The way that we have seen it in prior seasons with Greg Roman and, of course, these 2 running backs, Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins, is that he typically likes to run the hot hand, but he does like to give one of his running backs the vast majority of touches, typically like a 2/3 to 1/3 split. I think that we could have an opportunity in which potentially the lower of these 2 running backs based on ADP, J.K. Dobbins, could win the job. We're going to have to wait and see how they look in the preseason, how the distribution of opportunity does end up panning out, and additionally get an idea as to whether or not this is going to be a 2-headed monster. Are they both going to get 10 total touches per game? Are they both going to get even utilization within the red zone? These are questions that certainly will determine whether or not we want to utilize, in the case of J.K. Dobbins, 13th round, draft capital in selecting him and having him be a running back that is on our bench that could, over time, appreciate in value as the course of the season surpasses and be someone that can certainly fill in for injuries and or for bye weeks. If I knew for certain that the Los Angeles Chargers rushing attack was going to be top 10 in all statistics this upcoming season, of course, I'd like to invest in one of these two options. But considering we are not 100% certain as to what we're going to see from this new regime and this new culture of the Los Angeles Chargers, I think we just have to try to invest into one of these two. Obviously, J.K. Dobbins is moving up draft boards, but is still of value. And if, in fact, he can demonstrate throughout the remainder of the preseason that he can be of value and still has juice in his legs, I don't mind investing in him. Otherwise, if he shows that he is hobbled still and isn't going to be able to compete within this backfield, then we'll go ahead and we'll pivot in the direction of Gus Edwards. Okay, guys, those are going to cover the 6 players that I wanted to mention today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you guys enjoyed today's content, click the like button, subscribe if you haven't yet already. Again, if you guys want more rankings, my draft guide, all that kind of jazz, you can either check it out via Patreon, where you can ask me unlimited questions, get reviews on your overall teams. You know, I can talk to you about draft strategy, all that kind of stuff available via Patreon, via the 2024 Fantasy Champion tier, or, of course, use code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy. Get the draft guide, get the rankings, get all the rankings over the course of the year that, of course, are all still included on Patreon for those of you who are looking for that. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.